Good evening. A warm welcome to the opening of Unearthing the Present, the 4-day program, in conjunction with the exhibition Earth Indices by Julia Bruno and Armin Linke. It is my great pleasure to briefly introduce you to the program and tonight's core readings. What do geoscientists hear when they listen to the Earth? What are the tools and practices to allow us to read the Earth's changes? And how do we, as in all humans, then make sense of the transformations in the Earth system? In the past 2 years, the Anthropocene Working Group has been assembling stratigraphic evidence to demonstrate the geological reality of the new Earth epoch. In the coming days, we will connect these geological analyses with a discussion about the changing scope of social and political agency they imply. In collaborative core readings, geoscientists, researchers, and artists will decipher stratigraphic samples from Pacific corals, from lake deposits in northeastern China, or from the speleothems in an Italian cave. They will examine the microscopic traces left in the planet's surface by the burning of fossil fuels, nuclear bomb tests, or the disruption of marine ecosystems. The aim is to jointly reconstruct the geological record of the Anthropocene and to identify ways and means of responding to the signals from the Earth's archives. The research thus defines the Anthropocene is an act of great political, social, and cultural significance. Because these stratigraphic materials constitute both the symbolic and material representation of a new geologic epoch, that is, a new epoch for locating the role of humanity on this planet. Moreover, their investigations provide evidence of the impact that humans are inflicting on the Earth, and at the same time signal the end of modernist idea that separated nature and culture. Altogether, they form an archive that represents the material histories of the past centuries, a geology of the present that also lends itself to the creation of new forms of planetary knowledge within the sciences and far beyond. The program comprises in 5 different layers. Yesterday and today, we started with a scientific forum in which the Anthropocene Working Group and its associated teams and laboratories presented the final research results from 12 selected locations. Tomorrow's continuation, a public forum, offers space for dialogue with the researchers. Following this forum, 8 demonstrations on markers will take place, focusing on the varied chemical and biological markers and tracing their significance and intricate histories. On Saturday, Clashing Presence explores the critical clashes of planetary and societal time and the injustices the Anthropocene entails. For the final session, What if the dam was removed?, panelists will address questions of agency and governance that underlie any meaningful answer to the current challenges. And finally, a series of exchanges departing from the exhibition Earth Indices will link the research material to broader social and political contexts. Tonight, we will start off with a series of close readings of the stratigraphic archives produced by the geoscientists who researched and analyzed them throughout the last 2 years, alongside other humanities scholars. Together, they will jointly study the sediments of a Canadian lake, an Antarctic ice core, a Chinese marl lake, and coral samples from the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean. They chronicle the industrial impacts, technological changes, socio-political transformations, and violent ruptures of the emerging Earth epoch. With this event and more to come later this year, we slowly close a decade of collaboratively produced research ventures, artistic projects, and networking programs on the Anthropocene. We had the pleasure and privilege to develop these together with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and the Anthropocene Working Group, as well as many more vested partners. Some of you have been involved in this work since the very beginning. My colleagues Christoph Rossol, Yannick Müller, Niklas Huth, Kalina Rosé, Nili Wagner, Fiona Shipwright, Niklas Hoffmann-Wahlbeck, and Georg Schäfer, with whom I had the pleasure to conceive these projects throughout the years, and we would like to thank you all for your commitment and deep engagement throughout the years. Anthropologist Victor Turner sought to illuminate the threshold state, which he described as in between, as a moment in and out of time, a time of indeterminacy, of ambiguity, in which we, and I quote, slip through the net of classifications of the world that we have known until then. I still recall Liz Hadley at a meeting of the Anthropocene Working Group here at the Haus in May 2019, saying that working with this material is life-changing. And isn't it the case that exploring the Anthropocene strata as a collaborative practice between fields, disciplines, and our daily lives could help us to slip through the net of classifications of the world and transition into a shared planetary practice of addressing the challenges of the present and the uncertainties of the future? And now I hand over to Francine McCarthy, who is earth scientist and the main researcher of the Canadian Crawford Lake sediments, and she will be joined by Michelle Murphy, science and technology studies scholar and historian, and the Anthropocene Working Group member, Mark Williams. I wish us all inspiring 4 days.
Start by watching a video for a few minutes, and then we'll do the core reading. So this was our work in 2019 when we went out on the ice on this small Canadian lake. Groups from several Ontario universities, Ontario is a province in Canada, so several of us got together to take these cores, and you will see the birth of one of the cores, and I like to refer to it that way. And so when the film clip is over, I will discuss this core with you.
Before and after, that's the whole thing. You gotta clean the house before and especially to get a time. Yeah.
The nightmare is going to be keeping us on the pulley. So much slack. Yeah, so then,
yeah, exactly. Don't stand too close to the muzzle.
You guys get on the tripod. Started with that. Do you want to allocate the wire? Guy? Yeah. Come here, buddy.
I think we're looking.
Are you looking
let
at
me
it?
pan this way just a
Just
bit.
give us just one more minute, just see if we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to start in the summertime. Finish.
Yeah. The last one.
Like no light bulbs.
Yeah.
Hold that first, and then if it doesn't fall over, then we'll go.
Get her tight. Put it tight.
slack to keep the heading. So much of it.
Yeah.
Got a big one.
Okay. It's way ahead of me.
Guys watching.
Oh, nice.
Thank you. Come down. All right. Oh, I think it's great. Oh man, this is very good.
Yeah.
Oh, now it makes sense. I see him right there. Okay.
Here. These the units above this the settlement layer are really clear.
Trying to figure out something.
Okay, so what we have here is the lake bed when we just took the core. You see light, dark layers that are summer, winter couplets. And every year there will be another couplet added to this for millennia. So we look here, we see the brown color until here. And then there is an interval here of dark color, light dark laminations. Right here is the color change from the brown to the dark. This is the about 200-year interval that the Wendat were living here. And there was a whole village of several hundred Wendat who were doing what people do to make a living. And so they were injecting a large amount of organic matter, and biologic productivity in the lake increased, and that's what you're seeing there. And this below it is before there were ever humans in this region, at least humans who were doing enough in the watershed to cause a change to the water. So they may have been hunting and gathering, but there wouldn't have been people farming, which is what disturbs the land. It allows for more runoff, more erosion into the lake, more nutrients to come in. Right here, we have the very, very sharp color change from a brown to a almost black, very, very dark color, is indicative of a sudden increase in organic productivity in the lake, which is associated with the clearing of the land by the people who got the deed in 1820, I believe. And this varve apparently dates back to 1822. There is a very dark varve here that everyone notices that I believe is associated with the 1870s when there was a short-lived logging mill at the bottom of the lake. So that would have introduced an awful lot of organic matter all at once. For what the Stratigraphic Commission has suggested as the base of the proposed Anthropocene epoch is 1950 because of the bomb spike, and I am quite sure, based on previous work that I've done on other cores, that 1950 is right around here. Because I think this very thick white line that I was interested in, I think it was 1945. And so that would be the base of the proposed Anthropocene epoch. Okay, so that is the process of taking a freeze core. And I have been reading cores much of my life, and normally the cores, you have to do a lot of very technical investigation with fancy scientific machines and with microscopes. But with this core, as you had a chance to see in the field, as we have some models here, we can actually see the story with our very eyes. We don't actually have to look very, very closely at what's inside the sediment. So I'm just going to go through the reading of a little bit more detail with you again now, and I'll be introducing you to my colleagues who are here and some colleagues who will be joining us live from Crawford Lake in a few minutes. So when this type of freeze core is taken, and you see we put the dry ice in and the metal tube becomes super cold, it drops into the sediment and it freezes the side of the lake to the core so that we actually have every sediment layer preserved for us. And that's one reason that I can tell you this story by just looking at the core itself. And we can look at the different depths along the core and tell the story. And the other reason is because Crawford Lake has a very special lake chemistry and dynamics that allow for light, dark, light, dark, light, dark layers to accumulate every year like tree rings. So I'll begin at the base of the core, where we have rather boring looking sediments, sediments that you'd find just about anywhere, until the time when people, indigenous people, settled in the area, built long houses, and practiced agriculture. And there are several crops that we know they grew, the Three Sisters mode of agriculture, which is very sustainable. And one of the most beautiful pollen is the pollen that's on the small screen up here, sunflower, and it looks like a little sun. And so it's not a very high magnification image, but I hope you see that it looks like a little sun. And when the pollen of these cultigens was first identified, well below where we know that there was European land clearing, the investigations into this site really began, and the longhouses that are reconstructed that you would have seen are an example. So in this part of the core, boring, we don't really see a whole lot going on, and then we start to see light, dark layers, annually deposited like tree rings, because people were disturbing the soil. Hundreds of people living in this village, mostly women and children. They were matrilineal societies, so that they were living there and growing these crops, and the men would go out hunting and occasionally show up, from what I understand. When they were doing this, they were liberating nutrients into the lake, allowing the calcite, the white layers, to precipitate. And we can see, if we look very closely at the sediment core, we can actually see several different times within this interval of indigenous farming that the varves, or these light dark couplets of sediments, are more clear, and other times they are less clear. This is because when the soil became less fertile, the people would move to another village for a while, several decades, and come back to the soil. So we can actually see this visually, and we can see it in the sediments, in the image of the core that you see more clearly even than in this model that was at the Royal Ontario Museum for many years. And at a year that, based on the varve counting, like tree rings, in 1486, for reasons that we do not know, these people left the village forever. Now, there would still have been indigenous people in the area, hunter-gatherer, Anishinaabe people, but the people of the longhouses left to go to another part of Ontario. So we actually see in the change from the very clear light, dark layers, we see boring sediments again. This is because there's not enough nutrients to make this calcite precipitate. And we see that until this layer here, when the British Crown encouraged colonists to clear land. And so I believe the permission to clear land came in 1820. By the 1840s, we have records of lots of white pine in particular being logged. And so we actually see that in the pollen records, that there's a decrease in the amount of pine. And when the core becomes very dark in color, and there's actually some very, very dark layers, this is when a huge amount of material was being flushed into the lake by this sawmill, this lumber mill at the south end of the lake. And this, once again, led to very clear light, dark laminations that allow us to see every single year and count every single year. Up until the time that the lumber mill was abandoned in the 1920s, the color remains black. So we see this in the color of the sediments. And then it becomes a little bit lighter the organic matter becomes a little bit lighter. And at that point, there's a little bit of farming going on in the area, but not a lot in the immediate area of Crawford Lake. By looking just at the sediments, and it would be in this part of the core right here, by looking at the sediments, we don't really see immediately the change in land use. What we see more clearly is the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, just after the lumber mill was abandoned. This was very dry, very warm, very windy interval in North America, so lots of light colored calcite, lots of precipitation of calcite. But when we get to the 1950s, which is the interval that the Anthropocene Working Group is looking to establish the new epoch, you don't immediately see a whole lot of change, but we have learned that the dark layers here on either side of these three very, very bright couplets, very bright light dark layers, actually represent acid precipitation. So this is no longer what's going on just within the immediate area of Crawford Lake. This is long distance transport, changes in the atmosphere, and about 50 kilometers upwind from this area is a very large industrial city with lots of steel mills. And we know, because we've looked since at the sediments under the microscope, that there are lots of little particles that were emitted by these coking coal, steel mills. And we get to a little farther up the core, and the dark layers get a little bit lighter. This is the conservation era, so this area was taken over by Conservation Halton. It is now a protected environment. And the 1970s was the time that people in North America were awakening to the fact that we really had to start paying attention to the environment. Lake Erie had been declared dead in 1965. People started to really think a little bit more carefully about what they were doing. So flue gas emission, controls were put in place. So the area in general becomes a healthier, happier place to be. And we can see that in the change in color of the sediments, of the varved sediments. So the story that I've told you is based not just on these light dark colors and changes in size and the tints of the varves, but it is also based on a lot of these more technical investigations that we've done. But I hope that you can see by comparing with this image of the core that we took in the video and this model that was painted by an artist at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto of a much earlier core, that like tree rings, we can correlate from core to core exactly. And yes, so now I would like to turn to our colleagues at the site of Crawford Lake in the township of Milton, Ontario. And they are Søren Brothers, who is curator of climate change at the Royal Ontario Museum, and Catherine Tamaro, who is an Indigenous elder and an artist who works in Toronto. So I would like to ask them, perhaps starting with Søren. Søren, what is your relationship to this core? I birthed cores like this. I've been working on these cores. What does it mean to you?
Thank you, Francine. If you don't mind, really quickly, I'm just going to give a quick land acknowledgement from where we are before I answer your question. We just wanted to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands here of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Arawonderon, the Métis, and the Anishinaabe, and on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. As a limnologist, as someone who studies lakes, and as the curator of climate change at the Royal Ontario Museum, the core plays a really doubly important role for me. I'm curating it also along with Deborah Metzger, the curator of botany, who I want to recognize as well, has, along with you, pulled me into this work and into this really exciting project. I'm, as someone who studies lakes, really fascinated by the history that lakes can explain to us the way that they reflect global changes and the way that they express them in such clarity. And especially Crawford Lake is such a great example of that. Through the position at the Royal Ontario Museum, I'm really excited about how that story can be told, and having that opportunity to tell the history of Crawford Lake as something that ties together the local and the global. It kind of blurs the distinction between them. And it also has on the same sort of thread, or through that same breath, this long history of the land where the colonialism is just one thread of this much longer and really interesting, vibrant history. So for me, those are the elements that bring together, that make this core, and having it at the Royal Ontario Museum so exciting. And should I go ahead and introduce Catherine as well?
Please do.
Okay, great. And as I do so, I really want to thank you, Catherine, for being here with us and offer you this tobacco, and acknowledging that we're here together today, and my deep appreciation for that.
Thank you, thank you very much. Kwei, everyone. I can't really see you, but I'm happy to speak to you and have the honor of being present today in the space which is where my ancestors lived. I'm going to introduce myself in Wyandot. In our language, we say Tomeshra Ijatsi, Ndatajaton, Ngyawish, Hatiuronk, Wandat Ndi, Toronto Indare, which means basically that my clan name is Tomeshra. I sit with the spotted turtle clan, or the small turtle, and am a citizen of the Wyandot of Anderton Nation, which is part of the Wendat Confederacy. So as mentioned, my ancestors were in this space, and I'm very, very connected with Crawford Lake. Thank you for the tobacco, Soren. It's a very important protocol for us to be given tobacco in exchange for any teachings we might share. So I believe that I'm here today to speak about the piece of artwork that I've created, which honors not only the core samples and the varves and their process of being extracted, but the story that they tell and how it interweaves with one of our narratives called the Bead Spitter. And to my right, to your left, you see the piece itself. It is a glass or lucite construction which holds what appears to be a wampum belt, but isn't. And it consists of beads which are mostly transparent or have some earth tones in it or in them. And it is attached to itself, if you will, by transparent fibers on a warp and a weft. And the reason that it is in this configuration is, of course, that it refers to the varve samples, the core samples taken from the bottom of the lake, but it also tells the story of one of our narratives about an old woman who at one point was called a witch, but probably many women have been called witches over time, who was sitting in a canoe on a lake, advising some young lovers about courtship protocols. And she was smoking a calumet, which is a pipe. And as she exhaled, her breath contained wampum beads and other kinds of beads. And she spat them out into the front of her blouse, into the canoe, and into the lake. And in conversations with Monica Garvey and Francine, I came to an understanding about how the chrysophytes and diatoms that settled, or their casings which have settled, would have settled at the bottom of the lake, could be referred to in that core sample, but also in the story of the bead spitter as they fell from her mouth through her breath into the water and settled. So in extracting the core sample, I also kind of extracted from the spirit or the body of the lake a depiction of those chrysophytes and diatoms and that spirit that animates them in the form of this belt. And in our traditions, a belt like this represents a conversation with the lake. A lot of Indigenous people, I particularly believe that the lake is a living being, and I respect it and its non-human personhood. And so it is with utmost reverence that I assembled, and also employed the use of two very young beaters to create this work. The references to our narratives, which are very sacred to us, the reference to the science, which is kind of what we call two-eyed seeing, so seeing from a Western perspective and seeing from an Indigenous perspective, and how they came together most beautifully in the depiction, I believe, of this belt configuration. So the Varv has great meaning for me. It was difficult to see it extracted from the lake, the body of the lake in some ways. And so I think that part of the making of this piece is to honor that extraction from a heart space, from a spiritual space, but also to refer to the scientific aspect by enclosing it in this lucite container, which, by the way, is filled with water from the lake itself. It's on a plinth or a pedestal, which kind of exalts its position in this world and in the scientific world. But in my eyes, in the natural world, it already holds that exalted position. So I hope that gives you a little clarity about the relationship between this piece of artwork, between the core sample, between our narratives, our stories about how the lake is an embodied being, and the relationship of this wise woman who counseled people about the importance of love in life.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I have not yet seen this piece in the flesh. This is as close as I'm going to get to it for a while, but thank you very much. So what I want to know now is Murphy's perspective on this core and this whole idea of going and getting scientific information from a living being that is the lake.
Thank you. I think we have some drone footage that we're going to be playing. Thank you, Francine, Catherine, Soren. So I'm Métis from Winnipeg, which is in the prairies of Canada, and I'm co-director of an Indigenous Science and Technology Studies lab that works in relationship to this place, which is 240 kilometers away from Crawford Lake. And right now, you're looking over Amjanong First Nation, which is an Anishinaabe First Nation, which is surrounded on all sides by an area called Chemical Valley. And Chemical Valley is where some 40% of Canada's petrochemicals are refined. And when Francine was teaching me about this core, she said that this moment here between in kind of the way that the core marked Indigenous settlement and time, and then colonial settlement was around 1870.
Right.
And when you said that date, it really jumped out to me because 1870 is the date of the refinery that we study in Chemical Valley. It's the oldest running refinery in the world, began in 1870, still running. It's called the Imperial Oil Refinery. It's ultimately owned by ExxonMobil, and it is the biggest polluter in the region. We have this refinery here and some 57 facilities because this is also the location of the world's first commercial oil field. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about the Anthropocene and we think about the importance of this core, right, I think of two things. One is the arrival of colonialism and the way that this core shows right away a distinction between the disruptions to the land that colonialism brought and a way of living with the land before colonialism's arrival. And then secondly, I would love to hear more. I know you talk about Hamilton, where the steel is made, and here's where the oil was made. If we look for a signal, something like plutonium, which we might, rightly attach to atomic testing done by the U.S. military, which was a big empire of the 20th century. And we look here, and we have the French and English empires of the 19th century, other big empires. How do we think about attaching to this one signal as plutonium when maybe the biggest culprits of disruption to land are things like fossil fuel production or colonial relations? So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that, the difference between a signal that's good for geology and that which is most signature
Right.
the disruptions of the Anthropocene.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. When the Anthropocene Working Group decided that they felt there should be a new interval of geologic time on the time scale that exists that would bring home to everyone the message that humans have had a massive and irrevocable impact on our planet. They wanted an interval of time to be marked around the world synchronously by a marker that could be measured, that was deposited around the world in a moment of time geologically within a year or two in real life, and that was deposited from the atmosphere, which is the only way it could be global. So the tests in the New Mexico desert, the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan, and then the nuclear arms race through the 1950s and 60s was an obvious marker. But in my opinion, that marker, while it's very, very good to show exactly where in this core that moment is, that marker will actually not last forever because it has a half-life, literally, and after several half-lives, it will no longer be measurable. But the spheroidal carbonaceous particles that are the remains of high-temperature combustion, like the coking coal in the steel mills in Hamilton, will be there forever. And to me, in this core at least, they are synchronous. They both start to ramp up in 1952, which happens to be the year that we get the first really detectable plutonium measurements around the world. So at least in this core, they are synchronous, and long after the plutonium is no longer measurable, sorry, Andy, if you're in the room, there will still be spheroidal carbonaceous particles, and the long-term impact of the combustion of fossil fuels will always be the marker to me of the Anthropocene. The plutonium is a useful chronological tool, but all of the various impacts, not just the SCPs, but all of the impacts of combustion of fossil fuels is really what is driving this mid-20th century change in the planet forever.
Mm-hmm. So the other thing I was really thinking about, so you're, tonight and other times I've heard you speak, you talk about birthing the core, and I know this is the replica of the core, and there's like the real core that you birthed. And you speak about the core with such kind of fondness and love, and you've spent all this time with the core. And, when I first heard you talking about the core, I got very emotional about it because I thought, this is not just an archive, right? This is land, like sacred land, right, that has the memory of colonial disruption etched in it year after year.
Right. And
that that relationship to land, right, is so much bigger than thinking about soil, right? So when we work in Chemical Valley, the elders are always talking to us about, we always must begin with our relations to land. Mm-hmm. The language comes from land. Land is the first teacher. And not only that, but our relatives are in the land and our future generations are in the land. So rather than a kind of biological understanding of intergeneration, right? It goes like body to body to body.
Right.
It's like land to body, intergenerational. And so I really saw this as kind of a memory greater than an archive and a relationship to livingness. Yeah. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, and I'll take this opportunity to go back to the Longhouse and bring both Catherine and Soren into this conversation, because in 2019, the film clip that we all watched here, I had become more involved, more sensitive to Indigenous culture and values, but I had not yet met Catherine or Monica, the PhD student who's Anishinaabe. And so we took the course and we didn't really think anything of it. But when we went back this year to take the cores that are now housed in museums at repositories, we did it in a way that was respectful. So Monica was trained by Catherine in some ways of respecting the land and healing the lake of the impact of having stuff taken out of it. It's sort of like when you go for a biopsy, you know. So we have been working together with the Indigenous community in order to understand the values and to do our work that we think is of global importance, but in a way that understands the meaning to Indigenous people, and that's the special connection between their lives and the natural environment. And we're really hoping, I think, those of us in the Anthropocene Working Group, that if we are successful in having a new interval of geologic time, that more people will pay attention to the impact of humans on the planet, all humans. And as individuals, we can take responsibility.
I guess I loved everything you said but the last part. And that's because, you know, this core tells a story of some people who were being on this land in a less impactful way and a really different and particular way of living that disrupted the land. And then when we get to this drone footage and Chemical Valley and the creation of this massive fossil fuel explosion beginning particularly in the mid-20th century, that's a few people.
Right.
And we are living in the disruption of it. And so, yes and no.
I see what you're saying. Like, the planet is paying the price for a few of us who are reaping the benefits. And geologists, I mean, that's a very odd thing, and Bernd mentioned this in the beginning of our session yesterday. We geologists are the people who help look for fossil fuels, you know, coal, natural gas, you know, various types of petroleum. And I think we have to be the ones to bear the responsibility to trying to heal it the way we did when we laid the cedar boughs around the holes that we cored in January this year. Do you, in the Longhouse, do you have anything to add to all of this?
Yes, I'd like to speak to this issue. I totally understand where our Métis colleague is coming from. Constructing this piece was an holistic process. I felt that the core sampling of the bottom of the lake was like pulling bones out of an ossuary. I had a very difficult time with it and suggested that we do ceremony to help heal the wound that was, from the extraction of the material from the bottom of the lake, but also the spiritual wounds in terms of interacting with that and activating that disruption or calling it forth, if you will. It was a very delicate matter as far as I was concerned, which is why I suggested that Monica do ceremony. And I also suggested that the core sampling stop, which was a very difficult thing to suggest because, I think exploration is important, but how far are we willing to go, and at what point have we gathered the material that we need to gather? So Francine was accommodating in that regard, and people have been very respectful of the suggestions that I made around possibly, letting go of the need to draw further samples from the bottom of the lake, respecting the lake as a being in its own right, in its own integrity and its own non-human personhood, and our interconnectivity with all of our relatives who live in the lake, not only from a microscopic level, but also all the water guardians that surround the lake, the plant matter, the beings, the other animals, and also the spirit, the energy of the spiritual, let me rephrase that, the spiritual energy of our ancestors who are imbued in the land around this place. This space is a very sacred space to me. It contains all of the history of my people and more, as well as is an indicator of all our relationships with our non-human relatives. So my way of depicting this was to kind of assemble these in that conversation. Your wampum belt is your word. It's your truth. It's your way of connecting to expressing ideas that will not change. And so this conversation with the conversation that I had with the lake and the body of the lake and the being of the lake will not change. This belt is, for all intents and purposes, my promise to continue to be a guardian of Crawford Lake for the rest of my life and any other subsequent lifetimes that I happen to be around, in whatever energetic forms I happen to be here.
And in that vein, oh, sorry, but I was going to say in that vein, Soren, as the keeper of the artifact that is now in the Royal Ontario Museum, that is a core that scientists in the future could petition to take some samples from, because it is a curated piece in the museum, and it's your very first acquisition as curator, is it not?
It is, yeah. And I would just add too to the conversation, I entirely, recognize the difference in scale of what we're looking at in terms of human impacts on the landscape and the negative impact of colonialism. But something for me that sticks out as really powerful that the core tells us is that humans have a long history of relationships with the land. And it's not as if a relationship is a one-sided thing. A relationship is always a kind of a two-way interaction. And I think there's a tendency to think of, when we change the landscape around us, that's always going to be a negative thing. And I think one of the nice things, and we can see this in like the national park system, where you have this idea that something is better if we just minimize any impact we have on it. I think it's nice to be able to use the core as a starting point in seeing that, yeah, people have interacted and changed the landscapes around them and lived with them in a respectful way. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just what we do as a species. And we've done that many places through time. But it's nice to be able to tell that story in a more complex way, where we can see, where we want to go to. That's not just pretending that we're separate from the landscape around us and trying to extricate ourselves from that, but just interacting with it in a better way.
Right. Yeah, and taking some lessons from the Indigenous people is a good idea. Catherine?
Yes, if you don't mind my interjecting, I think that's an excellent point. And to me, that two-eyed seeing, which is an Indigenous idea brought forth by a Mi'kmaq elder, is a great way to kind of study our human relationships with the land around us. I think we can do it from a scientific perspective, of course, but we can also do it from an Indigenous perspective, and we can honor both ways of being in the world as long as we're not destroying anything. And I think that people were cautious once they became aware and proceeded in a good way. So I understand the points about the disruption or the disruptive aspect and making that a landmark. I think that's a very interesting aspect of this whole piece. But there are all these other landmarks in here. There are all the cells, cellular matter and spirit and solids and transparents, beads and beadwork. And again, they're all tied together with the warp and weft of ancestral memory and time. So just perhaps a bit of a creative adjunct to what you were saying.
Great points. And I guess we only have a few more minutes. Murphy, do you have any other pressing thoughts? Mark, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I'd like to jump in on the sense of hope also that you might be able to develop from this core, because obviously it's a memory, a long memory of that lake, and it has signs in that lake of the way in which the system is recovering, I think, after the ingress of people. And
you're right, because I mentioned that when the Indigenous people started farming in this area, they changed the ecosystem forever. When we look at the little diatoms and chrysophytes who inhabited the lake here, they're different from those here. And even after they abandoned the village, it didn't go back to the way it was before. It was different. It was improved, better water quality, but not pristine. But key thing is improved. And then, of course, there was the land clearing and the lumber mill. But then when the lumber mill closed, again, it improved. But then there was the global signal of the great acceleration and the combustion of fossil fuels that even though nothing was happening near Crawford Lake, 50 kilometers away, there were all these steel mills and many other things that were going on. And this lake measures that impact. And I think from the perspective of the Anthropocene Working Group, it makes it a very good site because of that, because it's not a local impact that is occurring in the 1950s. It is a signature of what happened to the entire world. But then there's the conservation era. And the conservation era, people started to recognize in the 70s, US EPA, Canadian environmental standards, and yes, it got better. So not all better, it will never go back to this, but people, if they recognize what they're doing and they're willing to do something about it, spend a little money, maybe tighten their belts a bit, it can get better. And if we don't think it can get better, why are we here?
I feel like the thing that's hopeful for me is that when I think about the Anthropocene and constructing, trying to put together a problem the size of a planet, I get worried about what kinds of institutions, what kinds of structures would take on something the size of a planet, right? So then we're thinking of empires, we're thinking of multinationals, we're thinking of these really big structures, social structures that in many ways have made the Anthropocene. And so what I like about this project in particular is that it's not just guided by the planetary, but you're very much been trying to work with a local that's a rethinking of governance and recognizing indigenous jurisdiction as that which could kind of govern, or is present, continuously present in governing the land. And when I think of Chemical Valley, where, maybe Halton Conservation Area has gotten cleaner, Chemical Valley has not.
Yeah.
Amjanong has not. And so what we say there is that the land behind the fence is still sacred. So even when you are on the most disrupted place, that relationship to like loving land is still there, and that's a different kind of hope. But it's like a weird more than pessimistic, ongoing livingness of indigenous presence.
But I think, just to bring it back to the here and the now, the fact that it's an institution like HKV who took the lead on guiding this group of scientists through this is hopeful in and of itself, because it is a museum of world culture. It is not the government of country X, country Y, country Z. It is a group of people who are dedicated to culture and having people come together in a community of exchange and stepping outside our comfort zone. Mark and I were talking about that earlier. This is not what he and I usually do. A little closer to what Murphy does usually, but still. But we're trying to reach beyond our silos and not just stay in them. And I think that's important.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Is that our time?
I think we're done. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.